When the FBI arrives at a crime scene, it means local law enforcement has already seen something they can't explain. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It wasn't a crime of passion. And by the time federal agents walked through the front door of Joy Winter's home, they knew they were looking at something far more deliberate. Joy Winter was found dead in her own living room on a Tuesday morning. The call came in just after 9 a.m. A neighbor had noticed her car still in the driveway, unusual for someone who left for work by 7:30 every day. When no one answered the door, concern turned into alarm. What investigators found inside made their blood run cold. Joy had been killed with precision. There was no struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. Everything in the house remained eerily untouched except for her body. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like she'd simply collapsed. But the forensic team knew better. This was execution, not accident. And the absence of chaos told them something even more disturbing. Whoever did this had complete control. No forced entry meant she likely knew her killer, or at least opened the door willingly. But here's where it gets stranger. Joy Winter had no enemies. She wasn't involved in anything illegal. She didn't owe money. She wasn't having an affair. By every measure, she was exactly what she appeared to be: a devoted mother, a reliable co-worker, a quiet neighbor who kept to herself. So why was she dead? The FBI's Violent Crimes Unit doesn't deploy for routine homicides. They step in when patterns emerge, when a killing looks too clean, too planned, or too connected to something bigger. And Joy Winter's murder had all three markers. As agents began cataloging evidence, one detail stood out: her phone. It had been wiped. Not just turned off, completely reset to factory settings. Someone had taken the time, after killing her, to erase every message, every call, every contact. That's not panic. That's procedure. Whoever orchestrated this didn't just want Joy Winter dead. They wanted her erased. And in that moment, standing in a home that should have been safe, investigators realized they weren't hunting a killer. They were hunting a system, one that operated in shadows, used intermediaries, and left no fingerprints. The clock had started ticking the moment Joy's body was discovered. But the crime itself, that had been set in motion long before anyone realized she was in danger. By the time the FBI began pulling security footage, interviewing neighbors, and tracing her last known movements, the people responsible were already thousands of miles away, confident they'd never be caught. They were wrong, but it would take months and a dozen unexpected breaks to prove it. The first 48 hours of any homicide investigation are critical. Evidence degrades. Witnesses forget. Leads go cold. But in Joy Winter's case, the first 48 hours didn't produce leads, they produced impossibilities. Detective Sean Harmon had worked homicides for 12 years. He'd seen domestic violence that escalated, robberies that turned deadly, and crimes of opportunity that spiraled out of control. Every murder, no matter how brutal, left a trail. Un motive. A mistake. Joy Winter's murder left none of that. I've never seen anything this clean, Harmon told his team during the initial briefing. No forced entry. No defensive wounds. No witnesses. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The crime scene told a story of control. Joy had been home alone that evening. Her daughter was staying with a friend. Her ex-husband lived 2 states away. Security cameras on neighboring homes showed no unusual vehicles, no strangers approaching the house, no movement after 8 p.m. And yet, sometime between 8:15 p.m. and 6 a.m., someone entered her home, killed her, and disappeared without leaving a single trace. The medical examiner's report only deepened the mystery. Joy had died quickly, so quickly she likely never had time to scream. There were no signs of sexual assault. No robbery. Her purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter, credit cards and cash still inside. Her jewelry remained on the dresser. Nothing was taken. Nothing was disturbed. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about rage. It was about elimination. Detectives began working backward, constructing Joy's final day. She'd gone to work, picked up groceries, and returned home by 6 p.m. Co-workers described her as calm, even cheerful. She'd mentioned plans to repaint her daughter's bedroom over the weekend. She'd laughed at a joke during lunch. There was no indication she felt threatened. Phone records showed only routine calls her mother, her daughter, a dentist's office confirming an appointment. Text messages were equally mundane. She'd sent a goodnight message to her daughter at 8:02 p.m. That was the last communication anyone had with Joy Winter. But here's what kept investigators awake at night. If this wasn't random, if someone specifically wanted Joy dead, why was there no clear enemy? No angry ex-partners. No huertas disputes. No legal battles. No financial debts. Joy wasn't involved in anything that would make her a target. She didn't testify against anyone. She didn't witness a crime. She simply existed, and someone decided that was unacceptable. Jordan Berry, the FBI's lead profiler assigned to the case, reviewed the evidence with growing unease. "This reads like a contract killing," he told Harmon. "Professional. Impersonal. The problem is, people like Joy Winter don't get contract killings. So either we're missing something huge about who she really was." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. Or someone with serious resources wanted her gone badly enough to make this look impossible. And impossible crimes, Barry knew, were never truly impossible. They were just expensive. In most murder investigations, the answer is hiding in plain sight. A spouse, a lover, a family member. Statistics don't lie when someone is killed in their own home. The person responsible is almost always someone they knew, someone they trusted. So investigators did what they always do. They looked at the inner circle. Joy Winter's ex-husband, Ted Gardner, was interviewed within 24 hours. Their divorce had been finalized 3 years earlier, and by all accounts, it had been amicable. Ted had remarried, moved to Arizona, and maintained regular contact with their daughter. His alibi was airtight. He'd been at a work conference in Phoenix with over 200 witnesses. But detectives pressed anyway. Had there been financial disputes? Custody battles? Hidden resentments? Ted sat across from Detective Harmon, his hands shaking as he answered every question. "Joy and I weren't perfect," he said quietly. "But we figured it out. For our daughter. I would never." His voice cracked. "I loved her. Even after everything, I still loved her." Investigators verified his story. Phone records, credit card receipts, security footage from his hotel. Ted Gardner wasn't just innocent, he was shattered. Next came Joy's boyfriend, Carlos Stanton. They'd been dating for 8 months, and friends described the relationship as healthy, stable. Carlos worked construction and spent most evenings at Joy's house. He'd been the one pushing for them to move in together. She wanted to wait, Carlos told investigators, tears streaming down his face. She said her daughter needed stability first. I respected that. I would have waited forever. Carlos had been working a night shift when Joy was killed. Dozens of co-workers confirmed his presence. Time cards, surveillance footage, text messages he'd sent Joy throughout the night, messages she never answered. He'd found out she was dead from a news alert on his phone. Then investigators turned to Joy's family. Her mother, Carrie Reyes, had spoken to her daughter just hours before the murder. Their conversation had been routine weekend plans, grocery lists, a funny story about Joy's coworker. Carrie lived 40 minutes away and hadn't visited that evening. Joy's brother, Jay McAllister, was out of state on business. Her closest friends, colleagues from work, neighbors she'd known for years all had alibis. All expressed the same disbelief, the same grief. No one had motive. No one had opportunity. No one made sense. But here's what Detective Harmon kept coming back to. Joy's phone had been wiped. Her last messages erased. That wasn't the act of a panicked killer. That was the act of someone protecting a secret. Someone wanted her silent. Harmon told his team. "We just don't know what she knew or who she threatened by knowing it." The people closest to Joy Winter weren't suspects. They were collateral damage. Because somewhere in the background of Joy's quiet, ordinary life, someone had been watching, waiting, planning. And when the time came, they didn't pull the trigger themselves. They paid someone else to destroy her and everyone who loved her. 3 weeks into the investigation, the case had gone cold. No suspects, no witnesses, no verdicts. And then a single phone number changed everything. It started with routine data analysis, something investigators do when they've exhausted every other option. The FBI's digital forensics team pulled Joy Winter's phone records going back 6 months, cross-referencing every number, every text, every call. Most were exactly what you'd expect. Her mother, her daughter, her boyfriend, co-workers, the dentist, pizza delivery. But buried in the data, 3 weeks before her death, was a single incoming call from a number that didn't match anyone in her life. The call had lasted 11 seconds. Joy never called it back. When investigators traced the number, it led to a burner phone registered in another state. Dead end, or so it seemed. But the FBI kept digging, pulling records for that burner phone, mapping every call it had made or received. That's when the web started to appear. The burner had contacted 6 different numbers in a 2-week span. Those numbers belonged to people Joy Winter had never met. People who lived in different cities. People with no apparent connection to each other or to her. Boo Thomas, a truck driver in Nevada. Clayton Delaney, an unemployed mechanic in Texas. Justin Dugan, a bartender in Louisiana. These weren't professional hitmen. They weren't organized criminals. They were ordinary people with financial problems, minor criminal records, and one thing in common: they'd all been contacted by someone offering them money. Detective Harmon spread the names across a whiteboard in the incident room. None of these people know Joy Winter, he said. And as far as we can tell, none of them know each other. So why are they all connected to this burner phone? The answer came when they interviewed Bud Thomas. At first, he refused to talk. But when investigators showed him phone records, security footage, and made it clear they had enough to charge him as an accessory, he broke. I didn't kill anyone, Bud said, his voice shaking. I just passed along a message. A message. Bud explained that someone he never met them, only communicated through encrypted apps, had paid him $2,000 to deliver a package to an address in another state. He didn't ask questions. He didn't know what was inside. He just did the job and moved on. Who paid you? Harmon demanded. I don't know. It was all anonymous. They called themselves Jay. When investigators tracked the package Bud delivered, it led to Clayton Delaney. When they questioned Clayton, he admitted the same thing. He'd been paid to pass something along. No names, no faces, just money and instructions. It was a relay system, a human chain designed to obscure the source. And Joy Winter had been the final destination. Somewhere at the beginning of this chain was the person who'd set everything in motion. The person who'd hired strangers. The person who'd orchestrated a murder using people who would never be connected to the crime. Until now, follow the money. It's the oldest rule in criminal investigation. Because people lie, evidence gets destroyed. Witnesses forget, but money always leaves a trail. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit joined the investigation in week 4, and what they found was staggering. Not because of the amounts involved, but because of how carefully it had been hidden. The relay system of middlemen wasn't just about creating distance. It was about laundering intent. Each person in the chain, Bud Thomas, Clayton Delaney, Justin Dugan, had received payments through peer-to-peer apps, cryptocurrency wallets, and prepaid debit cards. Small amounts. Nothing that would trigger bank alerts or IRS scrutiny. $2,000 here, $1,500 there. Individually, the transactions looked like ordinary peer-to-peer payments. Friends splitting rent, paying back loans, selling used furniture. But when mapped together, they formed a pattern. Every payment originated from a different account. Every account was registered under a different name. And every name led back to someone who claimed they'd been hired to handle logistics for a mysterious employer they'd never met. The FBI brought in Lupe Gallagher first. She was a 34-year-old administrative assistant from Missouri who supplemented her income doing freelance bookkeeping. 3 months before Joy Winter's murder, Lupe had been contacted through a freelancing website by someone calling themselves Jay Mitchell. They said they needed help managing payments for a consulting business. Lupe explained, her voice tight with anxiety. I thought it was legitimate. They paid me $500 a week just to process transactions. I never asked questions. The transactions Lupe processed were payments to the middlemen. She wasn't moving drugs or weapons, just money. And because everything appeared to be standard business expenses, she never suspected anything criminal. When investigators showed her Joy Winter's photo, Lupe went pale. I had no idea. I swear, I had no idea. Next came Josefina Hicks, then Mindy Field, then Kristen Stout. Each woman had been recruited the same way. Each had been paid to process payments. Each had been kept completely in the dark about the ultimate purpose. They were human firewalls, layers of plausible deniability built to protect whoever was at the top. But firewalls fail when you apply enough pressure. The FBI's forensic accountants worked backward through every transaction, every account, every digital fingerprint. They traced wire transfers through 3 countries. They analyzed timestamps and IP addresses. They cross-referenced usernames and email accounts that had been created, used once, and abandoned. And slowly, painfully, the path started to emerge. Every payment, no matter how small or how obscured, eventually connected to a single source, a business account registered under a shell company in Delaware. The company had no website, no employees, no physical address, but it had a registered agent, a name on the incorporation documents, someone who'd signed the paperwork, opened the accounts, and authorized every transaction. Someone who thought layers of separation would keep them safe. Detective Harmon stared at the name on the screen, his jaw tight. We've got him. But first, they needed proof that would hold up in court. And that meant getting the middlemen to talk. The first rule of conspiracy is silence. The second rule is that silence always breaks when the person holding it realizes they're going down alone. Detective Harmon sat across from Justin Dugan in a windowless interrogation room. Justin was 29, a bartender with a gambling problem and $3,000 in credit card debt. 6 weeks before Joy Winter's murder, someone had offered him $5,000 to deliver a package. I didn't know what was in it, Justin said, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. I just drove it to an address, handed it to a guy, and left. What guy? I don't know. Never saw his face. He was wearing a hoodie, sunglasses. It was dark. Harmon leaned forward. Justin, we've got your phone records, your bank statements, your car on traffic cameras. You're connected to a homicide. The only question now is whether you're an accessory or if you help us find the person who used you. Justin's face went white. I have a daughter, he whispered. She's 6. I did this because I couldn't pay rent. I thought it was just some rich guy dodging taxes or something. Now his voice broke. Not murder. Harmon slid a photo across the table. Joy Winter, smiling at a birthday party, her arm around her daughter. That little girl is 9, Harmon said quietly. She doesn't have a mother anymore. Because someone paid you to help make that happen. Justin stared at the photo, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. Then help us. And he did. Justin provided everything: encrypted app logs, screenshots of messages, payment confirmations. He admitted he'd been contacted through a dark web marketplace where people advertised discreet courier services. The person who hired him used the alias Architect. The same alias appeared in messages to Bud Thomas, to Clayton Delaney, to a dozen other middlemen who'd each completed one small, seemingly unconnected task. One delivered cash. Another rented a car under a fake name. Another purchased a prepaid phone. Another scouted Joy Winter's neighborhood and reported her daily routine. None of them knew why. None of them asked. But when investigators pieced it together, the picture was chilling. This wasn't a spontaneous murder. It was a project. Someone had spent months recruiting strangers, assigning tasks, paying them just enough to cooperate, but not enough to attract attention. Each person completed their part and disappeared back into their ordinary life, never knowing they contributed to someone's death. Marie Guerrero had purchased the burner phone used to coordinate the killing. Deb Pearson had rented the car the killer drove. Joni Swift had withdrawn cash in small amounts to pay the triggerman. Geraldine Alvarado had scouted Joy's home and confirmed when her daughter wouldn't be there. None of them had ever met Joy Winter. None of them knew her name until detectives showed them her photo. And every single one of them broke down when they realized what they'd been part of. He told me I was helping with a surprise party, Geraldine sobbed. He said he needed to know when the house would be empty so they could set up decorations. I thought I was doing something nice. But the person who orchestrated all of this hadn't thought about parties. He'd thought about murder and how to commit it without ever getting his hands dirty. Every middleman pointed to a name they never knew. Every payment traced back to an account they couldn't access. Every message came from an alias that disappeared the moment it was used. But digital anonymity has a fatal flaw. People make mistakes. And the more complex the system, the more opportunities there are to slip. The FBI's cybercrimes unit worked around the clock, pulling metadata from encrypted messages, analyzing keystroke patterns, tracking VPN routes across continents. They weren't looking for a smoking gun, they were looking for a single thread that didn't match the pattern. And they found it in an email. One of the shell company accounts, the one used to pay Lupe Gallagher, had been accessed from an IP address that briefly bypassed the VPN. It was a 2-second mistake, likely a drop connection that reverted to the user's home network before reconnecting. But 2 seconds was enough. The IP address belonged to a residential internet provider in Northern California. When investigators cross-referenced the location with public records, property ownership databases, and vehicle registrations, a name emerged. John Bailey. On paper, John Bailey was nobody. A mid-level financial consultant. Divorced. No criminal record. He lived in a modest suburban home, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and kept to himself. But when investigators started digging deeper, the facade cracked. John Bailey had access to offshore accounts. He'd traveled internationally 17 times in the past 2 years, always to countries with strict banking privacy laws. His social media was sterile, curated, almost robotic. But they could search his home, seize his electronics, and see what he'd been hiding. The search happened at dawn. Agents moved through John Bailey's house methodically, room by room, photographing everything. The living room was clean, almost sterile. The kitchen showed no signs of regular cooking. The bedroom was sparse: a bed, a nightstand, a lamp. But the home office told a different story. 3 monitors, 2 laptops, external hard drives stacked like books. The room hummed with the sound of cooling fans and blinking router lights. This wasn't the setup of someone who casually browsed the internet. This was a command center. Forensic specialists imaged every hard drive, every device, every USB stick. And when they started analyzing the data back at the lab, they found what they'd been searching for. Encrypted files containing names, addresses, and photographs. Payment logs matching the exact amounts sent to middlemen. Drafts of messages sent through burner apps. Research on Joy Winter, her work schedule, her daughter's school, her boyfriend's shifts. And then, buried in a password-protected folder, they found communication logs. Messages between John Bailey and someone else. Someone giving orders. Someone who'd hired him to organize the entire operation. John Bailey wasn't the mastermind. He was the architect, but someone else had commissioned the blueprint. And that person had one connection to Joy Winter that no one had considered. Family. The name in John Bailey's encrypted files stopped the investigation cold. Not because investigators didn't recognize it, but because they'd already cleared him. Richard Winter, Joy's ex-father-in-law. Detective Harmon pulled the original case file, flipping to the interview notes from week 1. Richard Winter had been questioned as part of the routine family canvass. He'd expressed shock, offered condolences, and provided an alibi that checked out completely. He'd been at a charity gala 2 states away the night Joy was murdered, surrounded by witnesses, photographed by event staff. He'd seemed devastated, genuine, grandfatherly, but the messages told a different story. Forensic analysts recovered hundreds of communications between Richard Winter and John Bailey, dating back nearly a year. The early messages were cautious, coded discussing projects and solutions and problems that needed handling. But as the correspondence continued, the language became more explicit. She's poisoning my son against me. She's keeping my granddaughter away. I've tried everything legal. Nothing works. And then, 6 months before Joy's murder, I need this resolved. Permanently. I don't care what it costs. Richard Winter hadn't pulled a trigger. He hadn't hired a hitman directly. He hadn't even been in the same state when Joy died. But he'd set everything in motion. Richard was a wealthy man, old money, investments, real estate holdings worth millions. He'd built his fortune through careful planning and strategic distance. When his son Ted divorced Joy, Richard saw it as a failure. When Joy got primary custody of their daughter, he saw it as theft. In his mind, Joy Winter had stolen his legacy. So he'd hired John Bailey to solve the problem in a way that could never trace back to him. Bailey recruited the middlemen. The middleman hired the triggerman. And Richard Winter remained a grieving grandfather, attending memorial services and comforting his son, all while knowing exactly what he'd done. When FBI agents arrived at Richard Winter's estate, he answered the door in a tailored suit, calm and composed. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "how can I help you?" "Richard Winter, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and I'd like to speak to my attorney," he interrupted, his expression never changing. Even in handcuffs, he showed no emotion. No panique, no regret, because in his mind, he'd done nothing wrong. He'd simply removed an obstacle. He'd used money and planning to erase someone he saw as unworthy of his family name. He believed that wealth and distance made him untouchable. But as agents led him to the waiting vehicle, Detective Harmon stepped close and said quietly, "Joy's daughter asks about her every single day. She's 9 years old, and she wants to know why her mom isn't coming home. You took that from her, and no amount of money is going to erase what you've done." For the first time, something flickered across Richard Winter's face. Not remorse, fear, because he'd finally realized the truth. The perfect murder only works if you never get caught. And he'd been caught, guilty on all counts. Richard Winter showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Even in defeat, he maintained the cold composure that had defined him. But as he was led from the courtroom, his son Ted sat in the gallery, staring at the father he thought he knew. "I wanted to protect our family," Richard had told investigators during one interrogation. "Everything I did was for my son and my granddaughter." But Ted hadn't asked for this. The granddaughter Richard claimed to love would now grow up knowing her grandfather had murdered her mother. Joy Winter had been 36 years old when she died. She'd been planning to repaint her daughter's bedroom. She'd been saving for family vacation. She'd been living a quiet, unremarkable life until someone decided that life was inconvenient. Richard Winter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. John Bailey received 25 years. The middlemen, those who cooperated, received reduced sentences ranging from probation to 5 years. And Joy's daughter was left with questions no trial could answer. Detective Harmon visited her months after the conviction, bringing closure where he could. She asked him the question that haunted everyone involved. Why did he hate my mom so much? Harmon knelt down to meet her eyes. He didn't hate her, sweetheart. He just loved control more than he loved people. Because that's what this case had always been about. Not rage, not passion, control. Richard Winter had believed that money could buy silence. That distance could erase guilt. That planning could create the perfect crime. He was wrong, because the perfect murder doesn't exist. It just costs more when it fails. If the story affected you, if I made you think about trust and evil and the systems we create to protect the vulnerable, then subscribe to Cold Truthfuls with Alex for more in-depth true crime stories that examine not just the crimes, but the human cost and the lessons we must learn from them. Hit the subscribe button because these stories need to be told and the victims deserve to be remembered.